All right, so here's an architecture of what we're going to be building. We are going to have Angular components use Angular services to talk to a Node.js server through HTTP AJAX, and it's going to receive all the HTTP get, put, post requests, and is going to use it to drive a Node.js service to interact with a data source, which is, in this case, it's going to be a hard-coded array of quizzes and questions and whatnot, which is going to be the data that we're going to be interacting with. Later assignments are going to be discussing on replacing this data source from just a plain old file. We'll be storing it in a permanent for permanent storage using MongoDB as a non-relational database. So here's what we're going to be building. We're going to create a couple of Angular components that are going to be representing quizzes for courses. So right now we already have the capability of retrieving courses from a generic server, and we are listing it in the course list or course table, however we called it, I forget. And what we're going to do is that we're going to add a link at the end of the courses, right? So that if you click on quizzes, you are then navigate to a separate screen called quizzes, and that's going to display all the quizzes for that course, right? Now this list of quizzes is going to come from a remote server, which is going to be the focus of this assignment. We're going to retrieve the list of quizzes, and we're going to render them as a list like hyperlinks, right? Now these hyperlinks are going to allow us to then click on that particular quiz or the start button, and then allow us to start interacting with that particular quiz. Now for now, the list of quizzes is always going to be the same regardless of what the course is, right? Regardless of which quiz you click on for whatever course, you're always going to get the same list of quizzes. Ideally, you would get different quizzes for different courses, right? But we'll leave that complication for later. Right now, it's just going to be the same quizzes for all the courses. But in reality, you would want different quizzes for different courses. To create the navigation between the course list and the quizzes, we're going to create a route, right? So that these hyperlinks are going to create links that have this pattern. It's their course, the course ID, and then the quizzes. So that when you click on that link, it'll navigate to a component called quizzes component that implements this list of quizzes. Okay. To generate these hyperlinks, here's an example on how you would create these hyperlinks. Right, these hyperlinks over here on the left-hand side. Right, so right next to each one of the courses, right, you can create a hyperlink called quizzes, and then the course ID, and then quizzes. Right, so that if you click on that, it'll activate this route, and then render the quizzes component. Once you navigate to the quizzes component, you need to render this list of quizzes, and we're going to be able to retrieve these quizzes from a service, right, which you're going to be building. The interaction, so that we can retrieve these quizzes, we're going to encapsulate the access to the remote server in this service called Quiz Service Client. We're going to read the course ID. Right, we're going to read the course ID from the route, right? And ideally we wouldn't be finding all the quizzes. Instead, we would be doing something like find quizzes for the course. But again, for this time around, what we're going to be doing is we're really not going to be using the course ID. This is kind of future proofing for later when we are going to have different quizzes for different courses. Right now, we're just going to retrieve all the quizzes and render them, and we're going to bring them and populate a local quizzes array, which we can then iterate and render the quizzes, right? So in the quizzes component, here in this quiz component over here on the right-hand side, we're going to iterate over that array of quizzes, right? And render hyperlinks, right? From the title, we're going to use the title to generate the hyperlink, and we're going to have a button on the right-hand side, this button over here, which is going to be identical to the hyperlink over here, but it's going to be rendered as a button. If you click on that, right, notice that the URLs are identical. And are going to be mapped to a different route, right? And that route is going to go into a different component that's going to render all the questions for that quiz, right? So which will be implemented in a separate component, right? So yeah, there you go. So that's the communication between these two, right, and how to render this right-hand side of the quizzes. So these are two different screens, right? This is the course table screen or the course list screen, and this is the quizzes screen, implemented in two different components, rendering in two different screens. All right, so once we activate this URL, either by clicking the button or the hyperlink on a particular quiz, you navigate to a different component. That component is called the quiz component. Now the quiz component is going to render that particular quiz. And the quiz is going to be rendered as a list of questions. So for instance, quiz 3, if you clicked on quiz 3, you would display, you know, the first question, the second question as a list of questions. And we're going to navigate to this component by using this new route. This URL, courses, course ID, quiz, quiz ID, is going to be mapped to quiz component, right? The component that we're going to be implementing here. And that maps, notice that this URL, right, pattern maps to the URL pattern of the hyperlink from the list of quizzes, right? It navigates to this component. Here's an example on how to retrieve the questions for a particular quiz. Also implemented in the same. Actually, this is a new service called Question Service Client. So we have two service clients, right? We have the Quiz Service Client and we have the Question Service Client. This retrieves all the questions for a particular quiz, right? So we read from the activated route the quiz ID, and we use it to then fetch the questions for that particular quiz, right? And then we store it in a local array of questions. We then use that list of questions to iterate over the questions. So here we're iterating over all the questions, and as we iterate, right, depending on the type of the question, notice that there are two types of questions. There is a multiple choice question, and there's a true/false type of question, right? So so we're going to use the type of the questions to decide to whether either render one of two components, either the multiple choice question component or the true/false question component, right? And if it's multiple choice to type, then it renders this one. If it's true/false, then it renders this one. For this, we're going to be using a new Angular feature called the ng-switch attribute, which is going to compare the value of a variable against multiple switch cases. If it's one or the other, right, it renders one component or the other component. Make sense? Also, we're going to learn something new in Angular. We can pass data down to a component using attributes. So presumably the component is going to define a state variable, a class variable called question, and which we're going to bind it to a variable in an array that, as we're iterating over a list of questions, we are going to bind that instance to a variable inside of that component, which it will then use to render that question either as a multiple choice or as a true/false. So these components are going to be new components, right? The app multiple choice question and the true/false question. So we ask you to implement both. The true/false question, right? It's going to be an Angular component, right? It's going to have this name, true/false question, and it's going to take as argument, right, a question as an input, right? And it's going to render as follows. It's going to render, at first it renders this way, right, where it just displays the actual question, and then it gives you the choices true and false. When you click on the true and false, it displays at the bottom. As you click on it, it displays at the bottom your choice, right? If you click on false or true, it displays your choice. And then if you click on grade, it will grade the question on the spot, right? It'll check to see if the answer is correct. It will highlight the correct answer and will put a checkbox next to it, and also a checkbox next to the question. If you answered wrong after you click on grade, it will highlight the correct answer, and and it'll highlight also your wrong answer in red. Also will display your answer. And if it's wrong, right, it'll put an X next to the next to the question. Okay. Here's an example on how you might go about doing this. You'll to be able to receive the question as an argument, as an attribute from the parent, we're going to declare a variable, in a class variable, and to bind it to the parent attribute that is being provided by the iterator that's passing all these questions. We need to annotate it as an input, so with @input, right? So this binds it to the attribute that is being passed from the parent. We are initializing the structure of the question for the true/false, right? This data is being provided for us from the parent through the attribute. We also are going to bind that button when you click on it. We're going to bind it to this function so that it knows whether you are grading or not grading. At first, you're not grading, but if you click on that button, we're going to change that false to a true, and we're gonna use this variable, to drive whether I should show you and highlight whether the question is right or wrong, and drive whether I put the icons or the background green or red, right? So that's for the true/false. Now for the multiple choice question, you could think of multiple choice question as a generic or more generalized version of the true/false question, right? So whereas the true/false questions you only have two options, yes, no, the multiple choice actually allows you to have any number of options, right? In this case, we have 4 options. And so we first render the question itself, and then we give you 4 options that you can choose. Now in a multiple choice questions, these are mutually exclusive, meaning that if you choose one option, it unchecks all the other ones. Also here, if you click on your particular answer, it renders it at the bottom, and if you click on grade, same thing. It behaves like like the true/false question, right? If it's correct, then it just highlights the correct answer and puts a check mark next to the question. Instead, if it's wrong, right, it puts an X next to the question, and then it highlights your answer as being wrong. So it behaves the same way as the true/false, right? But it's a little more generic. For rendering this, we're binding the question to the attribute, also called question, as we're iterating and displaying each one of the questions, and we're using the @input annotation, right, to bind this with the parent attribute. Again, we have the same mechanism of grading, right, to know when we should highlight all this information. All right, so those are the components. Now these components, the quizzes component and the quiz component, both are going to be using services to go fetch the quizzes and the questions for the quizzes from a remote server, which you're going to be building. To do that, you're going to have to create service clients, RESTful web service clients in Angular. One of them implemented in a quiz service client, and the other one in the questions.service.client. In the quizzes, you're going to use a find all, right, to retrieve all the quizzes so that you can render that array of quizzes when you navigate into the quizzes component. And if you click on a particular quiz, you might want to have a find quiz by ID so you can retrieve maybe the title of the quiz, the name of the quiz, so that you can display it when you navigate to a quiz. You're also going to have an additional web service client called question service client, which is going to implement the retrieve all the questions for a particular quiz, right, which is going to be mapped to this URL, right, and it's going to return an array of all the questions and then use to render all the questions for a quiz, right. Don't forget to register all your service clients as providers in Angular in the app module.ts. So remember to do that. All right, so that's the client side, right? The user interface. And now the main focus of this assignment is the Node Express, right? So Node Express, we're going to be using this technology to create web services, RESTful web services using Node.js. Right. First, we'll create a service right, that is going to allow us to retrieve all the quizzes, to retrieve a particular quiz by ID. For now, the data is going to live in a hard-coded array, right, and stored in quizzes.json. So we'll have 3 quizzes, quiz 1, 2, and 3, with unique identifiers. Next week, we're going to introduce the MongoDB, which is going to allow us to store this information in a non-relational database as opposed to hard-coding here in an array. Also, the focus of this assignment is to only do read operations. We're going to be reading from this array. We're not going to ever modify this array at all, right? We're only going to be reading from this array. So you'll find only, find all quizzes, find quiz by ID. There is no option here for being able to create new quizzes or delete quizzes or none of that, right? And in particular, we are focusing on use cases for students, and students are going to only have read capabilities of looking at a quiz. They're never going to be able to delete a quiz or create a new quiz or modify a quiz, right? So only read operations. So this is a service which is going to define just a couple of functions that manipulate or access an array or find a particular object instance in an array and then exports it as an API. So we'll talk about that today more in detail. Once we have the service, we're going to expose that service through a controller, very much like we did in Java, but instead we're going to be using Express to expose this through a RESTful API. These are the two URLs that are going to expose the RESTful API, one for retrieving all the quizzes and one for retrieving a particular quiz. And this is how it's going to be implemented, right? So that we are going to use app. App is an instance bound to the instance of Express, and Express is an API that allows us to create servers, create and respond to HTTP GET, POST, PUT requests. Here we are responding to a GET request for all the quizzes, and it's using the service, the quiz service, to retrieve all the quizzes and send back an array of quizzes. So that's for the quizzes. For the question, we're going to have a separate service on the server, which is going to access data from questions for a particular quiz. So here it is, so questions for a quiz, we pass in the ID of the quiz and it retrieve only those questions for that particular quiz. For now, the questions are going to be represented in a JSON file called questions.json. And here's an example of what those questions might be. So we have here a couple questions for quiz 234. So we have another question for 234, another question for 234. We have 3 questions for quiz ID 234. Notice we have these are the quizzes, and these are the IDs for the quizzes 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, and 3, 4, 5. And so we're going to have here the questions for quiz 2, 3, 4. We also have a couple questions for quiz 3, 4, 5, and just one question for quiz 1, 2, 3. Again, the quizzes, the questions can be either true-false questions, which we have the type right here. The type is either true-false, or the type can be multiple choice. And if it's a true-false, then we have here what the correct answer is with a true or false. Whereas in the questions, if the question is a multiple choice, we have also the choices is an array of all the choices that we're going to render as radio buttons. And we also have the correct answer, right, of which of these choices is the correct answer. So there we go. So we have an array of questions. Once we have that, we declare a controller for the questions, right, which is going to expose this service as a RESTful web service, which is going to bind this URL, right, so that we can execute and retrieve the ID of the question and then retrieve all the questions for that particular quiz. All right, so once we have the controllers, the services, and whatnot, we can then create a Node.js server, which is going to load those 2 controllers, right, pass an instance of the Express. Notice here we're loading the Express library. We're creating an instance of that Express library, and then we're using it as an argument, right, to the 2 controllers so that it can define those 2 or 3 GET operations. And also we are configuring cores, so that we can have the Angular application, which is running on port 4200, is going to be able to communicate with this server, which is going to be running on port 3000, right? Same thing when you deploy this on Heroku. you're going to have your Angular application running on one Heroku domain is going to be talking to a Node.js server, which is going to be running in a completely different Heroku domain. So for that, we're going to have to declare the configure course. A note of caution here: when you deploy this on Heroku, this asterisk might not be enough. You might need to specify exactly, which is the domain that you want to receive communications from. So if your Heroku Angular client is running on on HTTP :// my Angular app.com, you'll need to specify exactly what that domain is so that you can allow communication to come from that particular domain. Right? Just a note of caution there. For deliverables, right? So remember, all deliverables basic is creating a release. In this case, there's going to be 2 GitHub repositories: one for your Angular application and one for your brand new Node.js server application. Right, so deployed into 2 different Git repositories, and then deployed into 2 different Heroku instances, right? And then they're going to be talking to one another, right? So we're going to need, let's see, we're going to need at least 4 hyperlinks, right? We're going to need a link to both of the repositories with your releases for those repositories, and then we're going to need hyperlinks to your Heroku deployments, or the Angular client, right, and this Node.js server both running on Heroku. So we'll need those 4 links. Okay.